Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Stats and Gaps Social Enterprise Across the English Regions event today. Thanks for joining us. I don't know about you, but where you are in the country, but it's nice and wet and windy and rainy outside, so you're not missing anything. We've got a really jam-packed hour session. This is one of those great challenges of being the chair, so I'm going to plead with all of the people contributing to try and help us keep to time, but we will make sure that we carve out some Q&A time from you, so we're very much looking forward to hearing from you. My name is Mel Mills. I work for Big Society Capital, a Senior Director for Social Sector Engagement, and very quickly going to do a bit of context, and then going to hand straight over to Emily Darko from Social Enterprise UK. So really just the context for gathering this information is myself in my role, and also in close collaboration with our colleagues at the Access Foundation for Social Investment. We found that many of the place-based programs that we've been working on have been looking for data, and I was often getting asked questions about whether the state of social enterprise around, say, female leadership or ethnic minority support in perhaps the southwest of the country was better or worse than somewhere else. And with Social Enterprise UK having access through the State of the Social Enterprise biannual research, it felt like a really sensible thing to do to open up that research so that we can try and support all the initiatives, whether they are those being run by Big Society Capital or Power to Change or SUK's Places or Local Access Place. So we hope that the publication of these 9 reports will be useful. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of the speakers about their particular angle on how the data might be useful. And most importantly, we're looking forward to hearing from you, the audience, as to the things that you think you can use it for and the gaps and things that are missing. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emily.
Thanks, Mel. Nick, are you able to click through the slides so we can get to the next slide? Brilliant. Next one. Lovely, thank you. And then the one after that. Brilliant. I'm Emily. I'm the Director of Research at SE UK. Oh, it's the one before. That's all right, Nick. You've gone one too far. Thanks a lot. So as Mel has mentioned, what we've done here with these reports that have been launched this week is we've cut the 2019 State of Social Enterprise Survey data by the 9 English regions, and we've also put together a brief analysis of the main distinctions in each region compared to the national average. So the main purpose is to make the data publicly available and for information and further analysis, but hopefully there are also some useful takeaways from the region to national comparisons that we've done. So I'll give a quick overview of some of the key differences noticed in each of the regions. Next slide, please, Nick. In the Northwest, trends towards co-ops aren't surprising, nor is the related degree to which staff are engaged in decision making. Strong local government engagement seems to correlate there with confidence in accessing larger amounts of external finance and in higher average turnovers compared to the national data. In the Northwest, social enterprises were, however, more likely to be led by white men and to not pay living wage compared to the national average. Moving to the Northeast, there were a lower number of survey respondents there compared to other regions. Social enterprises here were likely to be quite long established and strongly embedded in their local communities. They were less likely to be making a profit and less optimistic about growth than the national average. In Yorkshire and Humber, social enterprises are comparatively mature. There are fewer startups than the national average, and more organisations have been trading for 6 to 15 years. Turnover is higher than the national average, as were growth expectations, and social enterprises in this region were less engaged on environmental issues than the rest of the country. Next slide again, please, Nick. In the West Midlands, they have a lot more kicks. That's the legal form registration data shows more kicks on average compared to the national data, and lots of engagement with the local community again, more female staff and leaders than the national average in the West Midlands too. They were much less likely to apply for external finance, and if they did, it was for far lower amounts than the national average. Similarly to the Northeast, response rates to the survey in the East Midlands were low. However, social enterprises here in the East Midlands were slightly more likely than the national average to generate income from trading, and to have both increased turnover in the previous year to the survey, and to expect turnover to grow, to continue in the year following the survey. Those are the two questions asked about turnover. In the east of England, there were both more startups, but also more well-established social enterprises than the national average. And these social enterprises have, on average, more staff, more female staff, and more of these staff work part-time and have access to flexible working options. There was a high proportion of male leaders of social enterprise in the east of England, though. Next slide again, please, Nick. In London, there's also a similar pattern to the east of more startups, but also more well-established social enterprises, a tale of two cities compared to the national data. Survey responses were highest in London, as were organisations that self-identify as social enterprises. The region has comparatively strong growth expectations and was more likely to consider and to take on blended capital than the national average. And moving to social enterprises in the southeast, they operate locally and engage the local community in their workforce and on their boards more than the national average. They have fewer staff, fewer female leaders, and were less likely to engage staff in decision making compared to national figures, but they were more likely to pay the living wage and to provide staff training. They were less likely to apply for external finance, but when they did, they were more likely to consider applying to social investors. And last but not least, social enterprise in the southwest were comparatively young. They generated less income from trading, had smaller staff numbers, and were less optimistic about growth than the national average. And where social enterprises here did raise external finance, they were more likely to have used it to innovate, so to invest in new products and services. So whistle stop tour, the 9 reports are online on our website now. I'm really interested to hear reactions to the findings and to explore what more we can do with this information, as well as where we need to know more. Some results were predictable, others perhaps less obvious or less straightforward to interpret. And one aspect of understanding which has been on my mind is whether there's closer analysis of how the data aligns to local policy and infrastructure organisation activities in each area, and whether that would help us understand more about what the data is telling us. And for information, the next SOS survey will be happening in January 2021, so there is a direct opportunity here to feed in thoughts to how we might take this regional analysis forward then. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Emily, for that a fantastic canter through of all those headlines. As Emily said, you can find each one of those regional reports on SEUK's website, available for download now. Also, as Chair, and just wanted to let you know, to flag that there is a question and answer facility, or a question for you to ask facility in your panel to the right. Please do start to have any questions you have down there, and I'm going to hand straight over to Andrew O'Brien from Social Enterprise UK, Director of External Affairs. Andrew, so before the pandemic hit, government spent a lot of time talking about the levelling up agenda across the country, designed to try and ensure improved equality of opportunity for us all. So how do you think this sort of data can unlock these opportunities?
I think, first of all, it demonstrates that the sector is incredibly well spread across the country, and we know this from our national data. But I think these regional pictures really show that the sector is very heavily embedded in many of those regions and places where the government will be looking to really boost economic growth and economic performance. So looking at the North and the Midlands, those quote red wall seats that they won from the Labour Party for the first time in the last election. So I think the sector is very well placed with boots on the ground, support those kind of policy agenda and that policy idea. I think the proof will be in the pudding, and will be in eating. And I think that where we are struggling to see perhaps a clear agenda from government is there's a lot of focus on infrastructure and kind of bricks and mortar investment, so housing, new roads, new railway, but not a lot of focus, I think, beyond that. And I do think, certainly from our perspective, and I'm sure from many social enterprises on the ground, I think we know it's all very well investing in that infrastructure, but if you don't actually have the businesses on the ground to exploit that and to invest in people and communities and really commit to the longer term, it doesn't generate massive returns. So levelling up is something we're still waiting to see what the government's clear plans are for that, and hopefully this data will help us to feed into it. I think from my kind of perspective, looking at the papers and the fantastic work Emily and colleagues have done in analysing the data that we have on the ground, I mean, I think first of all, it tells us very clearly that the social enterprise sector is not the same everywhere. I think it's slightly structured differently in different places. Unsurprisingly, in the Northwest, we have a very strong cooperative movement. You know, obviously Rochdale being the birth of the cooperative movement globally. So it's unsurprising that, you know, there's a lot of cooperatives and kind of employee-owned and employee kind of developed businesses in those parts of the country. You look at somewhere like the Southeast, for example, which, you know, outside of London, there's not a big urban centre. You've got quite a dispersed, much more community embedded, community business focused social enterprise sector. So, you know, I think it's important for policymakers to think about that when they're looking at support for the sector. But equally, I was equally surprised by how much, despite kind of variations, slight variations in different parts of the country, how homogenous as a group it really is. I mean, in general terms, there's a lot of, you know, what's true for social enterprises in, say, the Northeast can be true for those in the Midlands, can be true for those in the Southwest. So I think sometimes we make a fetish, I suppose, these days about the local and making sure that we tailor policies and support really for a local community. And of course, I think, as Emily mentioned, it'd be interesting to know what the kind of local infrastructure and government support is for social enterprises in those localities and in those regions. But equally, you know, the challenges are very similar across different parts of the country. You know, there's a challenge in terms of access to finance. There's a challenge in terms of growth and getting access to space, getting access to staff, making sure there's opportunity for, you know, market development opportunities. Those are very similar. So I think what we need is kind of, I think, looking at this data from my perspective, is we need national government to be developing a kind of framework and a series of cross-cutting initiatives that can help social enterprises across the country on those areas, but enabling that local flexibility to take into account some of those issues I mentioned earlier. For example, you know, the different legal structures of social enterprises, some of the challenges in terms of those communities that they work in, particularly those deprived communities, or if they're working in Black and ethnic minority communities, or what fits the lay of the land there, and some of the kind of distributional challenges. So again, you know, looking at somewhere like the Southwest, where again it's, you know, heavily dispersed geographically across a large area, versus somewhere in London where, you know, geographically incredibly concentrated, and that you've got a much more coherent marketplace. So I think that's my reflection really, which is, you know, we shouldn't, I think sometimes we get very het up on the idea that you know, social enterprises, you know, and the whole economy, I suppose, and all businesses, every part of the country is very different from each other, and that there's no possibility of having a national plan, and no possibility of having a policy framework or a strategy that can support the country. I think our data shows that that's not the case, that there are cross-cutting issues. But on the other hand, I think we do need to perhaps look a bit more carefully at how different parts of the country are working with their sector, and whether, you know, there are differences in implementation, and whether we can support through whatever measures those are, whether there's a bottom-up initiative, social enterprises coming together. For example, the SUK and Access Foundation, I know, have our own separate places programs where we're trying to bring social enterprises together on the ground, that kind of bottom-up initiative, but also looking at kind of the role that national government can play, I think, in supporting and facilitating the work of local policy implementation. So those are my kind of broad reflections on that, but happy to now pass over to others to give their views, unless you've got any other comments or bits, Melanie, you want me to cover?
No, I think that'll do for now. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks very much for keeping to time as well, which is great. We're starting to get some questions come through, and I think they're starting to resonate with lots of things that the speakers are saying. So we'll come back to those if that's okay. And Nick, if you'd just like to advance the slides for me. And I'm going to invite our next panelist, Seb Ellsworth, Chief Executive of Access, the Foundation for Social Investment. Morning, Seb.
Good morning, Mel.
You know, we know in our respective organisations, when the State of the Sector survey comes out, then we're always keen to read what it tells us, particularly around access to finance, as well as the circumstances locally that might impact on those things. So some fairly big news recently. You know, government's decision to allocate a significant amount of dormant bank account money to Access, I know, is something that both Social Enterprise UK and Big Society Capital and others have been highly supportive of, and you know, seeing the difference that access to blended capital has made over the previous years. So I suppose that the burning question many people will want to know is, what are your plans to ensure that that money best meets the needs of individuals and communities in our places across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mel. And I will answer that exact question. I thought it might be helpful just to set a little bit of context around the role that Access sees blended finance having in meeting the financing needs of the sector, which these reports really help us further that understanding. And congratulations to Emily and colleagues for the analysis that sits behind them. And I suppose, give a bit of a flavour of how we use this kind of data to think about the role that we need to play. So a reminder for those of you who don't know, Access, the Foundation for Social Investment, really is the wholesaler for grant support around building the social investment landscape, so it better meets the needs of charities and social enterprises right around England. And we do that in two principal ways. The first is a range of grant and support programs that help charities and social enterprises to develop their enterprise models and really kind of access finance when they need to, so that help them put in place the plans to raise the capital, and then provide grant into social investment funds, which we call blended finance. And that blend, we believe, really is the bridge between what mainstream capital needs and what social enterprises need in terms of their access to finance. So, we all know some of the challenges that we've heard about over the years in terms of the sector's ability to access capital, and that's because mainstream finance, big money that might come into our sector, will have certain constraints around it. It will have constraints around the predictability of return. I mean, mainstream investors are going to need their money back, and they're going to expect, if not a large return, they're going to expect a return, and a return that they can reasonably predict. They're likely to want that money to come in at significant scale, because making small investments is inefficient. And depending on the nature of that investor, they may also need some liquidity, so the ability to move the money out again if their circumstances change. Now, those constraints tend to be really challenging for investing in social enterprises, because we know from the State of Social Enterprise Survey, on which these regional reports are based, that the typical size of investment that social enterprises seek is around 50 to 60k, if you look at that data over the last few years. We also know that social enterprises really benefit from a trusted relationship with their investor, and I think it's quite clear to see some of the differential appetite for investment across the regions here, does speak to the presence of social investors who are embedded in those regions. And I think it maybe isn't a coincidence that Yorkshire and Humber sees a greater appetite for taking on repayable finance when they have one of the most long-established embedded regional investors in the shape of Key Fund, based in Sheffield. And we also know that social enterprise business models, by their nature, will have slim margins, because we're obviously focused on reinvesting surplus into supporting our causes and supporting our beneficiaries and communities. And so, particularly when investors are looking at supporting relatively early stage investment, early stage enterprise models, it's likely that the successful ones are not going to generate enough return to pay for the unsuccessful ones, and the ones that will inevitably not repay all the capital. So there is a need for grant money, we believe, and subsidy more generally in those investment funds, in order to meet the risk appetite, but also the scale and the routes to accessing finance which the sector needs. And again, these reports really paint a really clear picture about both the national trends, as Andrew said, and the way they play out in different regions. So over the last 5 years, Access has been working with our partners in National Lottery Community Fund and Big Society Capital to develop a major blended finance program called the Growth Fund, which is now through 15 social investment funds right around England, some covering the whole country, some focused on particular regions, has invested in more than 400 organisations. And the average investment there is £63,000, so very close to the average that we know comes from the State of Social Enterprise research. And I think what's really crucial to understand about the way blended finance changes the ability of the sector to access capital is when you look at who those borrowers are. So they typically have turnovers of less than £250,000, which is half of the average turnover of other beneficiaries of social investment, so those that are accessing investment from programs that are not blended finance. And typically they have 1/8 of the assets of those organizations who are accessing finance from other sources. So the ability of blended finance to meet a much broader range of needs across the sector is really quite significant. Coupled with that, the focus, we all know social enterprises obviously focus on tackling some of the most challenging entrenched social problems in our communities and operate disproportionately in areas of deprivation. Blended finance allows the capital to flow equally to those more deprived communities, and more than half of the Growth Fund capital has been invested in the most organisations based in the 30% most deprived communities around England. And in total, it's now 1/3 of the social investment market in terms of deals done. So that blend has really changed the way finance can be accessed, and we hope we'll be able to do more of that going forward. So very quickly, in terms of what's planned, we have two major initiatives that are in development. The first is our local access programme, where we're working with 6 places around England to develop very focused blended finance programmes, again with big society capital investment, to support those communities. And they're based in 6 different regions, so Hartlepool and Redcar in the northeast, Bradford and Yorkshire and Humber, and we're going to hear shortly from Cameron from the Bradford Partnership. 4 boroughs in Greater Manchester, focused obviously on the northwest, Gainsborough in the East Midlands, Southwark in London, and Bristol in the southwest. And again, we're going to hear from Ed shortly from Bristol and Bath Regional Capital. So this regional analysis couldn't come at a better time for that programme and supporting those local partnerships to develop their plans. But Mel mentioned the 30 million we've just been awarded through the Dormant Account programme, which will start to flow to access quite soon. And that really is to focus on supporting the financing needs of the sector, particularly impacted by the COVID crisis. So that will come in 2 parts. And again, our role will be to invest grant subsidy into social investment initiatives in order for them to meet the specific needs of the sector going forward. The first is focused on emergency lending, so augmenting some of the initiatives that are already in place, providing emergency finance into charities and social enterprises with short-term capital needs relating to the impact of the crisis on their business models. And that's really to add a blend, add a grant layer on alongside the debt that those organisations take on, so that social investors are able to support a broader range of organisations than they otherwise would, and enabling social investment at this really critical time to be more relevant to more organisations. So we hope to commit up to 10 million for that over the coming weeks and months. But it may be that that isn't all needed, because the landscape is changing very frequently with initiatives such as the development of bounce back loans and other grant programs that are particularly focused on supporting the social enterprise sector. The second part is really focused on the recovery and where we think there is a continued gap augmented by this crisis for more flexible, more patient repayable finance that behaves perhaps a little bit more like equity is able to in the private sector. Of course, in asset locked organisations, that's much more difficult to do, but that same kind of patient finance that sits alongside the organisation's growth, we think there's a real need for that, and we will shortly be engaging widely with social investment intermediaries and other experts in the space to really understand what the sector needs going forward through that recovery phase. So there'll be more to say as our plans evolve over the coming weeks and months on that second phase. We very much look forward to this conversation to start to give us more of an insight into what the attendees here today feel that the sector needs. Thanks, Mel.
Thanks, Seb. I'm sure that will be music to many people's ears, that whenever we listen to social enterprise and charities, and I know I do a lot of that in different times up and around the country, those words patient, affordable, capital are the things that I hear. I may not always hear them in those words, patient and affordable, but essentially in my time at Big Society Capital, I can see how far we've come from really the only type of money being available was large sums to buy buildings. So that's good news all round. again, we've got some more questions coming through. It's great. I'm also really keen that you let us know any things that are missing in the report, or particularly things that surprised you. I think that would also be a good point for us to pick up with our panelists. So Nick, if you could just move the slides on, I'm going to welcome Kirsten for as the last speaker at this section. We're going to have Q&A after this, and then we're going to go to the regions. Ooh, I'm resounding a little bit. So Kirsten, social investment business has played a leading role in collaborating and bringing together data, whether that's been through your recently announced partnership with Tortoise or your role within the Social Economy Data Lab. I love a good acronym, SEDL. Oh, there we are. So I'm really just interested to know, how do you think, what have you learned, and how can data help all of us, the people on the call, to maximise the impact we have on place?
Great, thank you so much, Mel. I think it's a fabulous question to try and answer, and I think particularly interesting to kind of consider how data can support place within the COVID world, where one of the only constants to the pandemic, it really seems to be the need for information, and filling this gap is where data we believe can really be helpful to effectively prioritize our limited resources to local economies that really are most in need. So the previous speakers have really so eloquently spoken to how data can be used to support different designs of programs, of supporting the leveling up agenda, etc. And I thought I'd really just spend a bit of time maybe looking at the data side. So what data is out there, what are we busy doing, and what more do we need to do in order to make sure we have the right data to the right people at the right time in the most accessible way to inform this type of decision making. So firstly, just a little bit of background on SEDL. So the Social Economy Data Lab is a project within SIB, so Social Investment Business, and we really focus on collecting, using and sharing relevant information to help those within the broader social economy make better decisions in support of most vulnerable communities and individuals. So essentially, we're looking to bridge the information gaps here and helping to provide data resource. And tangibly, that comes through 4 different projects. The first 2 are really on standardizing and sharing deal level data among social investment partners to better communicate and show value to the social and financial elements of blended finance. And then the other 2 are really what I wanted to focus on today, specifically focus on plugging those COVID knowledge gaps through different projects. The one in particular that I thought might be helpful to draw attention to is that work that we've been doing to kind of try and describe the economic effect of COVID on local economies across the UK. So essentially, how else can we complement some of the data that's coming through the reports you've said, that have been released through SUK and others, and what other data is out there that can help us better understand the nuances to a local economy and how that system works. So we've been looking, and all of this is online, and go have a look at the data afterwards, but we've been using some real-time card transaction data scraped from 6 different banking sources to really understand consumption patterns, so spending patterns within local economies during COVID. And why we think that consumption or spend is so important is that it's kind of quite a critical leading indicator of economic growth within an area. It can help us understand how much money is flowing within an area, and it can help us kind of better understand who might in future move towards, more likely to move towards recession within local economies, and as a result, all of us in the social economy can hopefully get involved before we get to that point. So what we've been doing is plotting, kind of getting this disaggregated sales data across 6,000 wards in the UK to really get to granularity of data and understanding how the different local economies operate. And I think really important is to continue to track these types of economic changes within quite a granular understanding of the local system, because this crisis and the COVID crisis is not following predictable trends. Some of the US data is showing that affluent spenders are not bouncing back as the lockdown starts to ease there, which really then does have quite a perturbing effect potentially for those lower wage income earners in those same economies who rely on that money that's getting circulated for all of their employment, etc. So this data is out there, and I hope it can help to complement the work that SUK is doing. And I thought I might highlight a couple of findings just of interest. So we're finding that in terms of the economic effect of COVID, it's certainly not hitting local economies evenly. Those reliant on tourism and hospitality have definitely been harder hit. Cornwall, for example, has always been about 10% worse than the national average. So we found in terms of sales data that spending has dropped nationally around 38% from a week towards the end of April compared to the week previously. And this is data that we have ongoing. And Cornwall has always been a bit kind of 10% worse at that, at around 48%. Oxford has also had some particularly poor sales data, seeing a drop in 52% compared to the same period the previous year. And when we started to look at consumption patterns during Easter, which is obviously, you know, quite an important period of time for a lot of tourist localities, that there was a substantial drop, with the top 5 towns all being kind of experiencing drops in sales, all coming from tourist areas, and spending declines between 69% and 75% over that Easter period. So for many economies where that Easter boost, and certainly the summer boost as well, is kind of the equivalent to the full year of trade, that's a really substantial impact and hit on an economic perspective for that local economy. And another key finding, I know I have limited time, so I won't dwell on it too much, but just to hint a little bit more nuance on why it's so helpful to understand the data of granularity on a local economy, and why it's so helpful to segment according to region and to understand the differences, is that we've also seen some of the old inequalities exacerbated through COVID. So coastal towns particularly are getting hit particularly hard. There's British Red Cross data that shows that they were more vulnerable to COVID impacts before the crisis, and the sales data has shown that this has continued. So really, I guess my summary point, is basically that we need to make good decision making. We really need data granularity, and we need to be ambitious in how we look at a place and an economy from a data perspective, but also to make sure that that's accessible to everyone, because sharing data doesn't make you transparent. It's really how you use it that matters.
Lovely, thank you, Kirsten. That's great. So we've got an opportunity for some questions now, and I can see some in the Q&A panel, which is great. Could I just ask the panelists, so Emily, Andrew, Seb, and Kirsten, I missed anybody, how I hopefully, just turn your webcams on if that's okay. And I'm going to pick some of these questions to ask you to comment on. I think this is probably 3 or 4 sort of key topics. One of the questions that I was going to ask, I'm probably going to come to Seb for this one, but I know that this comes up time and time again, and I'm sure Andrew and a range of our colleagues will support this. I know it came out in some of the things that SUK leading, one of their asks was around business support. So we've got a question from John Merritt. It says, is there any growth and finance for business support or for infrastructure development and consultancy to help social enterprises in local social enterprise places? I mean, I think essentially we've got this old conundrum of how do you finance the support and help? And we've had a range of initiatives over the years, but how does that play into your plans, Seb?
Thanks, Mel. So particularly with reference to the 6 places I mentioned where the local access programme will be running, I mentioned the blend of grant and debt, grant from us via dormant accounts and debt from Big Society Capital, which will be blended into investment funds in each of those places. We've also earmarked £8 million from our endowment, which is a separate pot of money that we received in 2015 from government to support I guess really the business development aspects of that. So the enterprise development and what we all used to call investment readiness aspects of that work. So that's really kind of prior to an organisation being even necessarily thinking about taking on investment. How do we support them to develop the business model they need to put in place that responds to the local context and particular support they might need in raising finance. On a national level, we run a number of programs that do that work as well. The enterprise development tends to focus in particular subsectors. So at the moment, that's homelessness, youth, mental health, and the equality sector. And the Reach Fund, which supports organisations to take on repayable finance when they're already speaking to a social investor where there's a particular barrier that needs to be overcome, works with the majority of the social investment intermediaries who can refer organisations into that grant programme. But I think there is a much broader question about how infrastructure is financed, and the model that we've tended to take is in the jargon of these things, a demand-led model, which means that we tend to support the social enterprises with resource to then purchase the support they feel they need in a marketplace. There are reasons why we've made that decision to focus on that, but we know that isn't sufficient to sustain a kind of dynamic infrastructure layer, and there is also support needed directly for infrastructure organisations. So I think it's the right question. So some of that for the social investment ecosystem specifically can be supported through the Connect Fund, on which we work in partnership with Barry Cadbury Trust, but that's focused on particular projects and particular initiatives. It's not unrestricted funding for the infrastructure sector generally. So there are certainly other roles needed to support that ecosystem. I completely agree.
Lovely, thanks, Seb. And Andrew, I can see you nodding there, because I know this is things that we will feel the same. There's a sort of wider than question. We've got both Carol Boughton from Voluntary Organisations Network Northeast and Kate Welsh from Social Enterprise Acumen in the Northeast participating, and they're both asking questions about the role of infrastructure when it does and doesn't exist, and how we make sure that we can capture better data. So what's the role, I suppose, that Social Enterprise UK can place, and how do we work together better so that we can do those things?
I can take that one about the data, the specific questions about the data. So the first one, in terms of sample sizes in the East Midlands and the North East, they are small, and Kate has suggested that probably not representative in terms of things like community business and perhaps under-reporting startups, which is very interesting. One of the things that we're looking to do with the 2021 survey is more depth outreach initially with our social enterprise places to make sure that we can capture basically a wider and deeper range of data, so that we can then do things like Andy Wright is talking about, drilling into the regional data, looking at it at a more local level. So in terms of can we target major regional cities? Not for most of them, because we just don't have big enough sample sizes. The answer to that specifically.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Emily. Yes, there were a couple of really specific ones. But Andrew, it's fair to say that where there aren't, specific social enterprise networks, Social Enterprise UK is still really keen to collaborate. I know you have a range of ways that you do that. Is there more opportunity for us to work together?
Yes, I think there definitely is. I mean, I think we've got there are a few issues here. I think firstly there's a structural problem, and I don't think this is just about social enterprise. I don't think government's ever got business support right for any part of the economy, to be brutally honest. SMEs complain just as much about the lack of business support as social enterprises do. And we've been back and forth between national programs like Business Link we had a decade ago to the growth hubs which we've got now, and the balance is never there. I think it's always oscillating between government wants to do everything from the top and just distribute it down, and then another approach which is kind of just totally decentralized, let 1,000 flowers bloom, or well, not really 1,000 flowers bloom, then maybe 5 or 6 flowers bloom and the rest kind of die in a ditch somewhere. But that seems to be that's the problem we're getting into, and I think social enterprises have suffered like the rest of the economy from that. I think there is a policy consensus, I think, though, that that we're not going to go back to the kind of the RDA model, it seems. I think there's a general recognition now that maybe it worked in some places like in the Northeast and in Yorkshire, and maybe in some bits of the Midlands as well, but with other bits of the economy, those units were just too big. So I do think there's a kind of understanding that I don't think it's necessarily just LEPs, but I think that there is a recognition that there needs to be a much better local patchwork. I think the issue is about accountability and transparency of that, and I think the problem that social enterprises have is that we don't often have a seat at the table at the LEP level, and so that means that strategic focus is in there for the growth hubs. We're not really properly represented in a lot of chambers of commerce either, or in university systems. So again, those big decision-making bodies aren't really reflecting social enterprise. And unlike the charity sector, which has, as I was talking to somebody earlier, you have the VCS network there, the Council's Voluntary Service there on the ground. They've got a patchwork of hundreds of organisations that kind of locally mobilised charities. So, and we don't really have that. So I think we do need to work at different models. I think that where we can learn the lessons, though, is I think what we have an advantage of, because we're not tied to any particular legacy or project, is to develop things that work for those places and are constructed by those places. And what we need to do as a sector and where SUK I'm sure can help is to support social enterprises that want to come together to create those networks and then find the most appropriate way to plug those into existing infrastructure. And some of those will be quite big. I mean, for example, you take somewhere like the Greater Manchester, for example, where we have places on the ground, but you also have quite a strong combined authority that's looking to mobilise across a relatively large region. There's an opportunity to plug into some of those infrastructures. Whereas you look at somewhere like, say, the southwest of England, where actually, again, very geographically dispersed, and you're probably going to see a lot more smaller local units. And I think the message from SUK would be, we're always happy to work with social enterprises that want to connect together, to provide them with the resources to do that effectively in terms of, giving contact information or setting up conversations or moving those forward. But we do also need to find a way of linking those into that mainstream infrastructure, because otherwise the funding just won't arrive there. And unfortunately, the LEPs and the combined authorities and the local authorities will continue to have control over those resources. So how do we leverage that best into the sector, I think?
Okay, yeah, something that I know I've struggled with. So yeah, definitely a problem. Kirsten, I'm going to give you a heads up that there's a question from Matthew Bell about how we can use data locally to inform local strategies. But if that's okay with you, we're going to come to that in the second Q&A. There are a few more that we will come to. I'm just going to take Chair's liberty of trying to respond to Gareth's question, which is about how will social investors respond to schemes like bounce back loans? They're only 2.5% interest, up to 50k, easy access, and why would you apply for social investment at higher rates? The answer is you wouldn't. We, I think, are absolutely keen, and actually it's a great win when social enterprises and charities are included, just like Andrew said, in those mainstream, and essentially we are never going to be able to leverage the scale or risk guarantees that come with government schemes. So making them accessible to social enterprise and charities is absolutely key. And actually it's where the launch of the Recovery and Resilience Loan Fund came from. I mean, again, it's great that you can refinance a Supplyside, a coronavirus business interruption loan scheme fund. You can refinance one of those with a business bounce back loan, because essentially it's a better deal. And the Resilience and Recovery Loan Fund, which Social Investment Business is leading on, and we've been a partner along with Charity Bank, Social and Sustainable Capital, and Big Issue Invest, was designed because Supplyside should theoretically have been accessible to social enterprise and charities, but we actually knew that because you had to go through mainstream lenders, it was going to be really challenging to understand our business models. So sometimes the answer is we shouldn't compete, we can't compete, and actually we just want to encourage people. I know there's a lot of social enterprise and charities have accessed business bounce back loans. What we do need to do is keep working to make sure that we can make products more risk bearing, more affordable, with wraparound support. And the other question I get asked all the time is, how social is social investment? Well, actually, it's, I think you've really been able to see that in a pandemic. You see how many organisations have had to ask for changes to their terms of lending, and it's really at those times when we're able to come to the fore. But I'm really conscious of time.
Sorry,
so
Melanie, can I just feed into that just very quickly? I think
quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, just looking forward, I think what this does give us an opportunity to think about is kind of what is the role for social investment in the long-term needs of the social enterprise movement as well. As you know, we've got our Adebowale's Commission, North Victoria Adebowale's Commission on Social Investment. But I think what the bounce back loans have showed is that when a government is interested to, it can mobilise mainstream finance to do something and to actually support the mainstream economy. And maybe that provides an opportunity or a model where we can free up the limited public money there is to support risk capital, like the work that Seb's doing with that blended finance. We get a constant demand from social enterprises for kind of VC-like quasi-equity or equity-style capital. Maybe that bounce back loans is a model where we can get, the mainstream banks to invest large scales into the SME sector and the social enterprise sector, and then that frees up that public money. I think that's an interesting thing to explore. We'll see what the failure rates are and the implementation of those loans are going forward, but I think it could give us an evidence base to really make the case for, so banks basically to pick up what they should always be doing, which is they should be investing in viable businesses. That's what they should be doing. They just don't often do that in the UK. And then we can focus social investment on the really tough markets and areas where that just isn't going to work, and we need more flexibility and imagination.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Yes, I want to take on board that point. Right, I'm really conscious that we give our next speaker some time to reflect on the report. So, Nick, if you could just put us on, and thank you very much, panelists. We'll come back to you shortly. So I'm handing over. Oh, can you just go back one, please, for me, Nick, to Cameron? So Cameron's webcam's not working at the moment, but he's going to chat to you now about your reflections, Cameron, on seeing this regional report for Yorkshire and Humber, for Bradford, your local place, which I know is very close to your heart and you're actively involved in. Would you just like to give us some reflection both on sort of the local economic picture and how you think this data might help, and where you think the gaps are?
Thank you, Mel, for inviting me to speak today, and it's been a fantastic conversation listening so far. Mindful of time, so I'll try to keep it as focused as possible. And I'm actually very gutted that the camera's not working today. After 3 months, I put a blazer on for the first time today because I thought today deserved it, and I was hoping I would have got to show that off, but never mind. So my name's Cameron Rashid, and I'm the Chief Executive of 30 Chapel Street. With a co-working space that supports social entrepreneurs in Bradford, soon to join a global network of leading social innovators, and we're launching a hub here in 2 weeks. I'm also a director, a non-exec director. I was appointed in February to the Leeds Local Enterprise Partnership, and I know Andrew mentioned about having a seat at the table at that level, and one of the reasons I was approached to join that was the work that I'm doing around social enterprise. And I'm also a director for Bradford's bid to become City of Culture 2025. And I think finally, and most importantly and relevant for today's conversation, is one of the partners that's been leading Bradford's bid to join the local access programme, which we secured in January this year. So before I come on to a little bit about my reflections about the report and what's going on, a little bit about Bradford. So Bradford is one of the most diverse cities in the UK, with over 140 languages spoken locally. It's also one of the youngest cities in the UK, with 50% of our population under the age of 25. Barclays a few years ago said it's the best place to start a business, and PwC last year said it's one of the cities with the most growth potential. We're part of the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, and I'm proud to say that Bradford has a real strong female leadership within our city, which I think is definitely one of the reasons for the success in driving our economy forward. And I'd like to also say that every place will think that there's things that could have happened better during COVID-19, but locally I think we've had a strong response to COVID-19. So coming onto the report and some reflections. So as we mentioned before, in January of this year, we were announced as one of the 6 places that Local Access have awarded a grant and loan to be one of the programs on the Local Access program. And this report that you've done, looking at the Yorkshire and Humber one, I think will really help shape our program. So for example, looking at the report, it's highlighted that 61% of social enterprises saw 50,000 or less in investment. So when we're thinking about how we design a program and investment products which are suitable for the market, the finance section, for example, provides a great level of insight and data for us to use when we're going to design our products. Some of the other reflections on the report are that only 11% of social enterprises in our region had one or more BAME persons on the leadership teams, and yet 35% of our population here is BAME. And with our local access program, one of the primary focus was about a program which is inclusive, which is reflective of our local economy and the local population. So that highlights something for us, which is something we need to focus on more. And the other striking thing was that only 12% of social enterprises had any young people aged less than 25 on their leadership teams. And again, as a city like Bradford, which has 50% of its population under the age of 25, I think it's an important thing for us to think about how we address some of these gaps. And I think the local access program actually provides a great opportunity for us to do that. One of the things which I think was definitely missing on the report was, it's great to see that the report highlighted the social and environmental impact that social enterprises make, but it would have also been great to see the economic impact that social enterprises make. So just before COVID-19 happened, it was announced that the West Yorkshire Combined Authority had secured a £1.8 billion devolution deal. And I think the report's going to help us make the case for why social enterprises should be integral in that in them deal negotiations. But it would have also been very useful for us to have had the economic impact of social enterprises to take to the table. So I think it'd be great to see that in the future. Another reflection was which both Andrew and Seb made is, so Andrew said about how Rochdale was the global start of the co-op movement, and Seb mentioned how the North has done well with social investment as a result of the players like Key Fund. And the report also highlighted Yorkshire and Humber, for example, has 12% higher than the national average on staff on boards, and that was as a result of the employee ownership organisation being based here. And one of the things I want to kind of say to the people on this call and people listening in is that if there's a direct correlation of organisations and institutions being based in a place and the impact that they have on that local economy, then I would definitely think about how all major organisations in the UK in this space think about being based and having regional presence to make that impact as well. If there's anything else I would say just before I hand it back to you, Mel, is Yorkshire and Humber is an extremely diverse place. We've got coastal towns, we've got rural, and we've got urban. And it would be great to kind of consider how in future we can think about hyper-local, local, and district level data and how data is presented in that way. But again, thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to hand it back to you, Mel. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Cameron. I'm sorry we missed the blazer. That was brilliant. I'm going to swiftly hand over, Nick, if you just answer forward slide for me, just to introduce Ed Rowbury from Bristol and Bath Regional Capital. Floor's yours, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. You can hear me okay? Yeah, great, thank you. So also troubles with the camera, so sorry about that, but I will try and keep to time as we talk. So I guess just a very brief introduction. So Ed Rowbury from Bristol and Bath Regional Capital. We're a community interest company limited by guarantee, raising and placing investment into our region, and we are also, as Cameron's mentioned, on the local access programme. Delighted to be on that. We work closely with Big Society Capital on City Funds, which is a social investment fund related to that, and I'll talk a little bit about that briefly as I go through. So just in terms of this research, I guess just to re-summarise, if I may, what I learned, and I did learn because I didn't know this stuff relative to the other countries. So in the southwest, the social enterprise sector is young. It's primarily or more proportionally community businesses and CICs. It's more likely to operate at the neighbourhood or local level. There's more grant reliance, but there is a greater probability of an application to social investment through social enterprises. It's smaller in size and has sort of flexible working practices. It's less optimistic about growth, and it's more likely to innovate with investment that it receives. I guess, if I'm perfectly honest, I wouldn't have known any of that versus the rest of the country. So that's really already valuable intelligence. I guess the next question is, well, so what? How do we use it, and how do we locally connect with this research in a meaningful way? This feels to me, and I don't know if this is right, this is primarily a supply side analysis, not exclusively. So it's the supply that social enterprises provide to the market being the demand, the need that our communities and our places face. So I suppose my question is, how do we take this forward to connect this very useful supply side analysis to the local demand analysis? And I think, some of the programs that we're working on, whether they be the local access program or the city funds, are good places to start to land that. One of, I suppose, the interesting challenges is, and this to some extent comes down to the way the data is collected. One of the speakers picked up on the point, different levels of geography. So there's the southwest. This is an analysis primarily around the sort of M5, let's say, your motorways. But actually within that, I work a lot in Bristol. You've got the west of England, which is Bristol and Bath. We've got something emerging, which is the Western Gateway. That's a sort of M4 corridor intervention, a bit like the Northern Powerhouse or the Midland Engine, which spans Wales as well. So is there a way of slicing and dicing the data, urban, rural or coastal, to start not necessarily fitting with those different boundaries, but understanding the data at different levels. I guess then, just to sort of begin to wrap up, how do we tie this data into some of the local initiatives? And if I zoom into what we're doing in Bristol around the One City approach, One City plan, we have an economy board that's thinking about recovery. Well, in that, we're already getting local live data. We know that the BAME sector is suffering disproportionately and from a health point of view, but also actually we've got research that tells us that's the case from a business point of view. We also know that older people and younger people are suffering greater job losses locally than other people. So what role do social enterprises as a supply side initiative alongside social investment have to play to address some of those issues, and rapidly? I'll probably stop there, Mel, because I'm conscious of time. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Ed. That's great. Thank you so much. Yes, I am conscious of time. It's always going to be a mean feat to get all of these speakers and some Q&A. And I just want a minute to wrap up. But if I could just ask my panelists to put their webcams back on. And I just want to come back to Kirsten, because I think that there are a number of questions actually in the chat, and some of which we won't get to today. And I'm going to ask if we can capture those and perhaps feedback on them separately. But there's this piece about, how we use data and information to inform local strategies, which actually I think both Ed and Cameron have given some examples of stuff that they didn't know before. But, Kirsten, in your experience and with the data that you're gathering and sharing, how do you think this is the best way for us to do that?
I think it's a great question, and I think it also points to again, I'm going to pick up on that point around granularity, because when we looked at the sales data across those 6,000 wards, we also did a deep dive into kind of the ones that are next door to each other, and Grimsby versus Cleethorpes, for example, have very different experiences, although both experienced significant declines in sales data, 70% and 50%, I think, but for different reasons. And I think that nuance gives rise to kind of which business models are the right ones, etc. But I would say the use of it and how to get it in is, what I've seen is that it almost happens at different levels. So understanding from the data on our side that coastal really is suffering for a number of different reasons, kind of existing inequalities being one of them, but also exacerbated by COVID, is almost a little bit of a social investor approach to government and focusing on that level. But that same data is then getting used by charities and social enterprises to validate why they need to be working in Grimsby and supporting employment initiatives, because one of the underlying issues in Grimsby is a kind of low income and skills issue, concerns. So almost evidencing the need, and that is the important element within that local economy to be supporting when they go to funders, etc. But I think the important part to all of that is that we're all using the same type of data and within the same, but referencing what is most useful to each of the different levels. And people will look at it and cut it in different ways, which is why we need the granularity to be shared openly, I guess.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kirsten. What I'm going to say is that we're going to make hopefully all the Q&As available to all the participants afterwards, along with the slides. If the speakers are willing, their contact details, because there's a couple of questions, might be more specific. Certainly happy to chat to John, and I think there are some wider questions about how we work with the nations, which I know is always something that's on our minds. Also, that will include the links to download the reports. So I just wanted to summarise, if I can, just say it's been a really great collaborative piece of work. Really enjoyed working with both colleagues at Social Enterprise UK and Access in making this available. Keep your eye on Access's website and social media for updates on how plans are evolving and how that money is going to come out. There's definite opportunity for more collaboration, particularly where there are missing networks, and I'm sure we can work with our VCS partners more, so I'm sure that's over to Social Enterprise UK. In terms of SIB, plenty of data. I know Kirsten has supplied lots of links for us, to make sure that those go out in the follow-up email as well. A couple of things from me. If any of the stuff around social investment has touched a nerve and is more information you want to find out, please do have a look at goodfinance.org.uk, which is another collaborative project that many of us work on. I'm probably going to make a last plug or plea that alongside blended finance, social investment tax relief is one of the other ways that we manage to bring some subsidy in, and we are again working together really hard to first of all try and get it extended, and then most importantly get it improved. Check out getsitr.org.uk, lobby your MP, write to Boris. Generally free, do whatever you like, that we can try and at least hang on to it for now as part of the recovery. We're going to need to put our hands on every penny of patient and affordable capital we can have. And then finally, I would say, share the reports. They're all being shared on social media, as we say. Let other people know that they're there. Look out for SOS 2021. The more data that we give SEUK and SIB in their work, the more that they're able to share back. I managed it within about 2.5 minutes over. So I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much to all of the panelists for taking place, and also particularly to Ed and to Cameron. It was fascinating actually to hear that from a place space, how this information might be useful, and hopefully we can commit to work together and make sure that this is something that's on your radar in future years as the State of the Social Enterprise Sector reports hit down. Thanks very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. It's Ed here. Can you hear me? Oh, you're on mute.
I hear you, Ed. Yes, or I can hear you. Yeah, thanks very much. That was really good. It was always going to be a challenge. We probably could have done with an hour and a half, really, but